Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and I do reviews of both music and movies along with the occasional commentary piece on this channel. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please feel free to hit the like button and to subscribe to this channel for future content. And today I am doing another episode of the Critical Corner. This will actually be the 13th episode in this recurring series I do on my channel. And if you are new to my channel, well, if you don't know, the Critical Corner is a recurring series on my channel where I do reviews of either all movies or all music in shorter form. And today I'm going to be talking about movies because I have been very music focused if you haven't noticed lately. So let's go ahead and get started with our first movie. So this episode of the Critical Corner is going to be a little all over the place in terms of release dates for movies because there's some movies that I've seen quite a few months ago back that I wanted to talk about, and there's also some new movies that I've seen very recently. But for our first movie, we are going to go back a little bit and talk about Godzilla vs. Kong. Now, I'll be honest, going into this movie, I didn't have very many huge expectations. I'm not a huge fan of big monster fight movies. They're just not really my thing, and I get that I'm not maybe necessarily the audience for them, but I wasn't really a big fan of either Kong Skull Island or the Godzilla movie that came out a couple years back. They're not bad movies necessarily, but they just didn't really do much for me. I felt like I couldn't connect to the characters, and I just felt like action-wise they weren't even that interesting. But believe it or not, Godzilla vs. Kong is actually a pretty fun movie. I actually did enjoy this movie way more than I thought I would. Unlike the other two movies where I feel like they try to do way too much with exposition dump and plots before getting into stuff that could be fun, this one doesn't waste too much time on that, and instead is a lot more about the mindless action, which is what a movie called Godzilla vs. Kong should be doing in the first place, honestly. This movie is about the two titular characters at its core, which is what I do think makes it work. The action sequences in this movie are actually really good. There's a boat sequence in particular that I really enjoyed that puts King Kong in a pretty dangerous position where it's interesting to watch him struggling with a fight. And it's interesting to watch the two duke it out in many different places in this movie. I do wish there had been a little bit more of fight sequences between the two of them, but when those fight sequences do appear, they do work very well. Honestly, there isn't a whole lot to say about this movie. It is very simple at its core, just a lot of monster fights and something going on where apparently Godzilla, who used to be seemingly a sort of friend to the human, is becoming an enemy to the humans now, and they're trying to figure out why. And I suppose that is sort of intriguing, but the ultimate twist with it isn't as interesting as it could be, I suppose. And also, I will admit, the first half hour of this movie could have been cut out, and it would have been a lot more interesting. There is still some exposition dump in this movie that it suffers from. There are other people in this movie where I just feel like their performance doesn't work. Millie Bobby Brown in particular was very weak in this movie. I did not care for her character at all. I honestly didn't care for her character much in the Godzilla movie either, and here her subplot is just even less interesting than it was in that movie. Her subplot was the least interesting to follow, and I just feel like not much happened there. And whenever the human characters were interacting, I did admittedly lose quite a bit of interest. But thankfully, this movie still does have a real sense of fun, and I think it's well shot, and I think action sequences are fun to overcome some of the other problems. So I am going to give this movie a light 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's a mindless action movie, and if that's what you want, that's exactly what you're going to get. So check it out if you're interested in that type of thing. Next up is the Netflix animated film The Mitchells vs. the Machines, which is about a dysfunctional family who essentially gets trapped in the apocalypse, much to the main character Katie's dismay, as she wants to go to college and she wants to study film, but this robot apocalypse obviously interrupts that, and her family comes together to essentially fight against it. And we also see some complications with Katie and the rest of her family, specifically her relationship with her dad, as her dad doesn't necessarily agree with the dreams she's pursuing, or doesn't necessarily understand them. Essentially, this movie is very much so a message about how it's okay to have a dysfunctional family, and to overcome those problems, and how you can overcome those by trying to understand one another, trying to understand each other's differences. But also in this movie is a lot of laughs, a lot of great comedy, and a lot of just simply ingenious humor that I absolutely loved. Of course, that is to be expected when you've got a movie made by Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, two ingenious creators who have made the likes of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and the Lego Movie. So it was no surprise that this movie, much like those, was an ingenious mix of great humor and wonderful heart. First off, before we get into the story and the characters, I do want to talk about the animation style of this movie. It's somewhere between the Lego Movie and Into the Spider-Verse for me, which I think is great. This movie has a really interesting animation style to it that I love, and I appreciate particularly how clever it is that the animation style sort of reflects the main character and what she loves to do, because she likes to write sort of comic book absurd style stories, and that's what she films. And the movie almost plays out like that. There's a lot of wild animation and a lot of almost very energetic random animation interspersed in between certain parts, and it works very well the way that the animation plays out. It makes for a movie that is very energetic and very fun to watch, with a lot of creativity. All four of our main characters in this movie are very fun to watch, and I appreciate that they all get their own moments to shine, their own moments of comedy, and their own moments of genuine heart. Katie is a great main character, I think. She has a very relatable struggle that a lot of people will be able to attach on to. The fact that she struggles with her dreams and struggles with knowing what exactly she wants to do, and also struggling with forming a relationship with her parents because she is on a different level than them. She's on a different place than them, and she doesn't necessarily understand them all the time. But I also appreciate that this character does try her hardest to form these relationships, even if they are on a different level in where they're at right now. Rick is also a great character, perhaps providing the most laughs of anyone in the movie. Just the jokes that Danny McBride in this voice drops are just great. And it is nice to see the relationship between him and Katie develop. I think that is the heart of this movie. The relationship between the father and the daughter. Their dynamic is very interesting, and where it leads is very heartwarming in my opinion. But we also should not go without talking about the brother and the mother of the family. Both of them are also great. I particularly love how the brother just has this crazy fascination with dinosaurs, and it leads to some very charming moments. There's so many other great voice talents here, from Eric Andre to Olivia Colman to Fred Armisen, that all provide their own charm in this movie and all bring their own interesting things to the characters that they play. And it makes for a movie that is just endlessly fun to watch. Between all the great animation, the wonderful characters, the beautiful storytelling, this is a pretty great movie overall. I think the only critiques I would have for it is that sometimes the very frenetic pace it moves at can leave a little bit to be desired in terms of breathing room. You don't get a whole lot of downtime, I feel like, in this movie. Overall, I just really do not have too many complaints about this movie. This was simply a great animated flick that I really enjoyed. Phil Lord and Chris Miller have delivered yet another hit. And even though the humor here may not be quite as good as the timeless humor I feel like is present in the Lego Movie and Into the Spider-Verse, whereas this movie has a bit more pop culture humor, it still does have its charms, and it is still undeniably fun to watch. The dog pig loaf of bread bit, which I think you'll know if you've seen the movie, is one of the funniest moments I've seen in any movie this year. So with that, I'm giving this film a very strong 4 out of 5 stars, with obviously a very huge recommendation. Next up, we're getting into a movie I saw very recently, one of my 2 more recent movies, and one of my 2 more recent watches, and that is Spiral. If you do not know already, but I'm sure you probably do based on the trailers, Spiral is sort of a spin-off in the Saw series, which of course is known for its very torturous traps and the infamous doll/man Jigsaw and his demented plans to kill people who he views have done wrongs in society. Now, Spiral does not actually have Jigsaw in it, but it is obviously something where someone is inspired by Jigsaw, and that is probably the most interesting aspect of this movie. It is about someone who is essentially a copycat killer of Jigsaw, someone who was inspired by him, and essentially up to Chris Rock's character Zeke Baines to figure out why this killer is going after specifically cops. And it seems like he's targeting cops who relate to Zeke's precinct specifically. And so he eventually teams up with his partner William Shank to figure out these mysteries, while also going through his own complicated past, specifically with his father Marcus Banks, played by Samuel L. Jackson. Now, in some ways, if you see Spiral, you may not exactly guess that it's based off a Saw movie. There's some scenes where, if they were taken out of context, wouldn't feel like they belonged in a Saw movie at all. In many places, this movie is a police procedural, a sort of mystery movie about this detective trying to figure out what the motivations are of this cop killer. But there are definitely some places where you can see the Saw inspirations coming to fruition, especially in the moments where all these demented traps are put into place by this copycat killer. And honestly, I'm just going to go ahead and get some of the critiques out of the movie first, because I feel like it's unavoidable to talk about these critiques when talking about this movie. The traps in this movie really aren't that interesting. They're probably the least interesting part of this movie, in fact. And in some ways, they feel sort of disconnected from the movie at large, because you've got this police procedural going on, and then you've got these traps. And the traps don't necessarily feel connected to the other things. The traps definitely would belong in other Saw movies, I guess, but they feel a little extreme for the more mystery vibe that this movie is trying to go for in other places. Also, writing-wise, I will say that this movie suffers hugely in that regard. Now, Saw movies, even the best Saw movie, the first movie, did not have the most subtle writing, let's be fair. They've always been pretty on the nose, and this one is very on the nose too. It tries to have this political bent about cops and about police corruption, which I'll admit is an interesting angle to go for and gives this movie a little more substance compared to other Saw movies. But at the same time, it is very on the nose, very over the top, very obvious, and I think that does make the message suffer a little bit. Also, some of the writing is just exposition dump to the nines, and I just do not care when a movie does that. And also, some of the writing is just really awkward. Sometimes the characters are just telling you who they are, instead of just showing you what they do, or things like that, and it always bothers me when a movie does that. However, there are some definite positives to this movie. For one, the police procedural aspects, like I said, I do enjoy those. I enjoy the unfolding mystery, and I think it's pretty intriguing how it plays out. Now, once the twist does come up, once the twist comes to fruition, I do feel like it's a little obvious, and it's pretty easy to figure out. But at the same time, the way they do explain the twist is pretty fun. And also, the performances are pretty strong in this movie, at least from the three main characters. A lot of people have said that they did not care for Chris Rock as Zeke Banks, but I think he was probably the strongest element of this movie overall. He was the thing that kept me interested in watching this movie. I think he did a very good job of having some very funny moments and also some very serious moments. Also, Max Minghella was pretty good as William Shank, although I feel his performance here isn't as good as his very impactful performance in The Handmaid's Tale. I do still enjoy what he does here. And Samuel L. Jackson is reliable as always as Marcus Banks. He's basically playing himself in this movie, but you can tell he's having a good time, and I do enjoy the chemistry he has with Chris Rock. They work very well off each other. The somewhat mediocre pace this movie goes at is saved by the finale, where there's a really nice homage to the first Saw movie that I really appreciated, and there are some interesting things that go on, and I think the ending does have some pretty cool impact to it. I did appreciate the climax, and I think it did save this movie from being a little worse. In fact, I would say this movie is generally middle of the road. It has some good and some bad. So with that, I'm going to be generous to this and give it a 3 out of 5 stars. Consider that a very light 3, because this movie isn't great, but it's not horrible either. It was a decent watch, and there were some points where I was definitely enjoying myself, which is more than can be said for most of the Saw movies. So do give it a watch. If you're a Saw fan, I imagine you'll probably enjoy this. Next up is the movie Mortal Kombat. Now, this is another movie where I'm just not going to have a whole lot to say, because I feel like I'm not very well versed in this topic. I've only played Mortal Kombat games in passing, so I can't pretend to have much familiarity with the source material. As far as this movie goes, I guess it's fine. It is a lot better than I was expecting it to be, I'll be honest. I guess for me, the plot was probably the least engaging thing about this movie. It felt like what a lot of video game adaptations seem to do, which is having this chosen one main character who just has to discover his powers for himself and do a little bit of training, but overall they're very powerful and they become essentially unstoppable by the end of the movie. The main character here, I'll admit, was very thin and very uninteresting. Probably the least interesting part about this movie. All the other side characters were far more interesting than him. I specifically thought Josh Lawson's performance as Kano was a lot of fun. He played this character so utterly corny and cheeseball and over the top, but that's what I envision out of a Mortal Kombat movie, honestly. I feel like he was the one that embodied the spirit of the video games the most, probably, and I did enjoy his very fun performance. I also thought Joe Taslim was really good as Sub-Zero, providing a pretty menacing villain that I enjoyed. And I think most of the side performances were generally fun. These characters don't have any huge character arcs or anything, but it is fun to watch them. And I'll admit, some of the fight scenes were actually pretty cool. They actually had some pretty cool choreography, especially the beginning sequence. Next up is The Woman in the Window, a Netflix thriller about an agoraphobic woman who lives alone in New York, and she begins spying on her new neighbors, but she eventually witnesses a disturbing murder that happens, and she tries to figure out who exactly did the murder of the family. This movie was not that great. In fact, it was pretty disappointing, and it's very obvious that it's inspired by Hitchcock, especially the movie Rear Window. It makes it so obvious that, in fact, it almost feels like a ripoff in some ways. The only interesting performance here is Amy Adams as our main character, who is named Anna Fox. She was actually really good in this movie, and I feel like the movie did not deserve this good of a performance from her, because she really goes in, she really owns it, and it's just so disappointing to see her put into another not-so-great movie. Hillbilly Elegy last year, and now this movie this year. Also, I will admit that sometimes the central mystery of this movie is interesting, especially when you're questioning the main character's sanity and how reliable they are as a narrator. Admittedly, this unreliable narrator trope becomes a lot less interesting as the movie goes on, just like in other movies. You have to do something really interesting in order to make the unreliable narrator trope work, and this movie really just doesn't have it. Also, sadly, the other performances in this movie just didn't do much for me, despite the star-studded cast. Gary Oldman does not really get much time to be on screen at all, so I can't really say much about him. Julianne Moore and Jennifer Jason Leigh as the different Jane Russells that Amy Adams sees are not very interesting either. I feel like Jennifer Jason Leigh's performance just is utterly mediocre, and Julianne Moore's is a little bit too over the top for me, honestly. And then we've got Fred Heckinger as Ethan Russell. I'm so sorry if I'm saying that wrong. This is the main member of the family that Amy Adams' character interacts with, and his performance is probably the worst in the movie, unfortunately, and he's the one that's on the screen the most besides her. And I just didn't feel anything at all from his performance. As a whole, this movie plays out like a very mediocre thriller. Even in the midst of some moments that are almost so ridiculous that they made me laugh out loud, this movie still feels just really low-key at the end of the day, and just like a very basic thriller, not one that necessarily interests me at all. I'm going to give this movie a 2.5 out of 5 stars, and even at that, I feel like I'm being generous here. Stowaway is another Netflix original, and this is about a 3-person crew who is on a mission to Mars. However, a stowaway appears on the ship that has been knocked out, and obviously was very unexpected. And with low oxygen and low oxygen levels, the crew has an impossible choice to make. Now, on surface level, this movie's plot is probably the most interesting of almost any of the movies I'm talking about here. Has very intriguing ideas attached to it that I was admittedly pretty interested in as the movie went on. And when the stowaway appeared in the movie, I think the movie really picked up and had some interesting ideas going on with it. It faces some interesting moral quandaries that are admittedly tough to think about. If you were stuck in this situation, what would you do? If you knew that you had to potentially put your life on the line in order to preserve the lives of other people, would you do it or would you not? Anna Kendrick is surprisingly great in this movie as Zoe. I've never been a huge fan of Anna Kendrick as an actress, but I think her performance might actually be the strongest here. She really has an interesting character arc, and where her character ends, was not necessarily exactly where I expected it to, and that was something I really appreciated about this film. Daniel Dae Kim is also great as David Kim, providing a really nice counterpart to the other characters in this movie. Actually, the only performance that underwhelmed me was the one that I was surprised would underwhelm me. It was the one I least expected to underwhelm me, and that was Toni Collette as Marina Barnett. I'm not really sure why, but I just think that the movie didn't give her much to do. She was playing the captain of the movie, and I feel like she just didn't get much to do in this role. Also, I do feel like pacing-wise, this movie does move very slow. It doesn't really go anywhere for a while, and there's some parts where you're just wanting it to get to the point. It just feels like filler in some places, which is not what you want out of a space movie. A space movie, I feel like, more than any other type of movie, really needs to keep you on your toes. Ultimately, while I do appreciate the ending and what they did here, I also feel like they could have done a little more with it, because it just sort of ends and then the credits roll, and you're really thinking, oh, wow, that was really it? There's not any more to the film? Not any more to say? I feel like there could have been more to talk about, but instead they end the movie on a pretty underwhelming note where you're just left sort of sitting back and realizing that that was it and there's nothing else to go. I guess this was a decent movie, but I expect a little more out of my space thrillers. I just don't think this movie really delivered as much as it could. The performances do save this movie, as well as the central question, which I do think is really interesting to think about. So with that, I'll give this movie a light 3 out of 5 stars. And finally, we have the movie that I saw the most recently, which is Cruella. Of course, the Disney movie based on the villain Cruella de Vil from the movie 101 Dalmatians. And this movie is essentially this character's origin story, how she became Cruella, and how she eventually came to, for whatever reason, hate Dalmatians as a dog breed. And this movie is an interesting combination of, like, a 101 Dalmatians movie and The Devil Wears Prada, as we see Cruella interacting with Emma Thompson's character, the Baroness, who reminds me a lot of Meryl Streep's character from The Devil Wears Prada, and the two eventually form a sort of rivalry between one another, whereas the Baroness starts to teach Cruella, who is actually named Estella, whereas she first starts teaching her about fashion, and they first start working together, eventually a rivalry develops between the two, and we see that forming Cruella's sort of villain origin story in some very interesting ways. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I am not a huge fan of Disney remakes. I feel like most of them are extremely mediocre or very painfully awful, and there's only a couple that have impressed me. One of those being Christopher Robin, which I wouldn't call a remake so much as it is a reimagining of a particular character, that being Christopher Robin himself, and how he would be like in his adult years. So it's not really surprising, to me at least, that I actually enjoyed Cruella, because it is very similar to Christopher Robin, where it isn't as much a remake as it is a retelling of a character and how she came to be who she is. But I'll admit, I did have a lot more confidence in this movie than other Disney remakes once I saw that it was directed by the same guy who made I, Tonya, and it was written by one of the people who made The Favorite. That's quite a stellar backup cast you have there doing the behind-the-scenes production of this film, so I was very intrigued to see what they would make. And overall, I was pleasantly surprised by this movie. It actually does a pretty good job at making an intriguing enough story for Cruella de Vil, and one that makes sense. It actually makes a lot of sense that Cruella would be a sort of fashion designer in her younger life, and that a rivalry with a fellow fashion person would lead to her sort of becoming a villain. And I do think that actually giving her a sympathetic backstory was not a bad choice here. I think what helps this movie the most is its stylistic flair. This movie is sort of taking place in the midst of what would be called the punk rock revolution in Great Britain, and it really embraces that to its fullest extent, I feel like. For that reason, this movie has some of the most personality I've seen out of any live-action Disney remake in recent memory. It has so much flair to it, and I loved the music choices they had in this movie too. They added a whole lot of personality here. And of course, the performances here really flesh this movie out in some really great ways. Emma Stone is awesome as the main character, as a titular villain. She is eating up this role, and it is so much fun to watch her transition from Estella to eventually becoming Cruella. I'll admit, the movie does pick up when she becomes Cruella, as Emma Stone embraces this role with so much fun. Emma Thompson is also great as the Baroness, providing a very interesting counterpart to Emma Stone's character, someone who can actually clash very well with Cruella, and it's interesting to watch these two characters clash over and over in the movie, and how the relationship develops is very intriguing. I don't want to reveal where it goes, of course, but it is a lot of fun once the reveal happens, and it actually provides some interesting weight to Cruella's character that I wasn't expecting. I also can't go without mentioning Paul Walter Hauser's performance as Horace. He perfectly embodies this dumb, sort of fun, dumb minion character from the 101 Dalmatians movie. I think he does a great interpretation of this character, and he provides some of the biggest laughs in the movie. I love the character choices he makes, and I think his performance will unfortunately go overshadowed by Emma Stone and Emma Thompson, but he should not go unnoticed here either, in my opinion. And yeah, I think this movie is actually a lot of fun. Probably its biggest issue is that it is a little overlong, and it takes a while to get to the point. The movie, like I said, does pick up when Cruella does come into the picture. When she's not in it, I just sort of want it to get to the point, and it does take a while to get there. Also, it does still feel like it has some little over-obvious writing points in it where they're just feeding you exposition rather than showing you it. But still, I won't complain when I got more than what I bargained for out of a Disney remake, and one that actually has some originality to it. This is one of Disney's best remakes in quite some time. Even though it doesn't match up to Christopher Robin, I still really did appreciate what this movie did. I think it's a lot of fun, and I think Emma Stone, Emma Thompson's performances are worth the price of admission alone. 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. So yeah, that was my latest episode of The Critical Corner. What were your thoughts on any of the movies I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. Once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then once again, I ask you to give this video a like, and to comment on this video if you want to see any other types of reviews. Hopefully, there will be a commentary piece on the way soon, as well as an update video for the state of my channel. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.